How can African countries balance their economic and political relationships with China and other global partners, where African states will be seen as equal trading partners and not potential states for exploitation? So there's a lot behind that. What do you think is the right way to approach this question? How do we balance economic and political relationships?
If I may, I don't know whether you can hear me with my video on. This points to the debate about African agency. The whole debate about China in Africa has increasingly seen China as the active partner and Africa as the passive participant and sort of a victim to Chinese overambition, grand strategy, geopolitical, and so on and so forth. Whereas actually, the evidence from empirical studies, looking at specific case studies from country to country, shows a very deliberate engagement and active participation of African politicians, African elites in structuring some of these deals and engagements with China. In my research in Uganda, for instance, it is the Ugandan government officials who present proposals to their Chinese counterparts on the specific sectors. So China has this overall Africa policy that we want to encourage food security, South-South cooperation, infrastructure, health, and so on and so forth. But it's up to African governments to specify the specific sectors and the areas where Chinese support can be channeled to, and they identify the magnitude, right, of the projects and the nature of the engagement that they would like to see. In Uganda, for instance, in terms of food security and agricultural technology transfer, it was in cooperation with Ugandan state corporations, research institutes, agricultural research institutes, that they structured, for instance, the concept of the friendship farms. So China wanted to have these friendship farms way back in 2010 across 20 countries on the African continent. But it's Uganda that decided it has to be a fisheries project rather than a dairy project, and so on and so forth. Folashade's research goes deeper into African agency, and I think she can speak a lot to this.
Yes, I think you've really said it well, Josh. I think it's well, first of all, yes, to answer the question that was asked initially, it is an asymmetrical relationship. When you look at the trade figures, exports and imports, the trade balance, it is asymmetrical, although it is changing over time. And also, though it's also concentrated more in this trade is exporting to China is concentrated more in larger African countries. However, it's not, let's say it's not totally asymmetrical in the sense that there is many of these projects, many of these deals, whether it's trade deals, infrastructure deals, mining deals, very often they originate from African government demands. And so it's also important to look at all these questions, from the African actors' perspective, whether they are state, sub-state, or non-state actors. It's important to question this agency and to ask, to what extent have they been able to exercise agency here? And also look at it in a more comparative perspective. Africa is not a unitary actor. There are several countries, of course. There are different ways to negotiate. Or there are different ways that African governments are using to negotiate with the Chinese, moving from one government to another, sometimes within a single country. So I think it's important to look at it. And again, the literature has shown that there are so many different cases of successful negotiations, also others that have failed. And it's important to learn, from this and to to improve this relationship with China, but also with other external actors, by defining better strategies, on the African level, better strategies for engagement, to avoid fragmented negotiations, to bring in different actors, to make sure that some of the norms, whether it's construction, labor, environment norms, are better negotiated, that renegotiation is possible as well. So yes, I think that's my take in terms of how to make this less asymmetrical.
I was recently invited to brief some congressional staffers as they were preparing their congressmen and women for another congressional hearing in the United States on great power competition in Africa. And this was run by the Congress's subcommittee on Africa. And one of the points that I made is that the whole framing of US-China competition in Africa doesn't serve US interests in the long run. But I think, for the purposes of this conversation, I think what the audience needs to understand is that the more options African governments have, the better, right? If as Folashade pointed out, you have good negotiators, it's a very different scenario today from kind of just after independence, when the main relationship between African countries was with their formal colonizer, right? And I would argue that the tremendous interest that China has in Africa has only spurred other partners, other potential partners, not only the US, but also India, Japan, South Korea, Brazil, right? I mean, there are, and I would argue that for most African countries, this can only be a good thing if you can, if the kind of power to kind of play one off the other, or kind of have choices, is really kind of played advantageously.